Greetings, Princeps. This is the 57th episode of the God Engine Cast, a podcast dedicated to discussing the Adeptus Titanicus wargame produced by Games Workshop. It has been a while since my last episode, so we're going to start back with a nice, light episode with me discussing some questions that have been sent in from around the community. So let's just straight up address the podcast as a whole before we get going. It has been an awfully long time since I last recorded a show. Mostly this has come down to it being the summer holidays, and there's always seems to be something else taking my time, with both my kids and my wife all off school. I've had a lot going on. There was also the matter of the last episode I sat down to record. I had a great conversation with a bunch of my friends talking about paint competitions and painting scores for events here in the States. The quality of audio I recorded, though, was shocking. I had nearly every problem in the book, from background noise to people's audio coming in out of sync to missing entire sections of conversation. I haven't declared the episode lost, but a week into editing, I'm like 10 minutes into the episode, and it's going to take a lot more work. So that's kind of sapped my morale to get a show out. That all leads us to the show. So about a week and a half ago, I realised I was having this problem, and decided to set about trying to come up with a solution to get me recording again, to get me back on the cycle of putting out material. And to this end, I decided that I would take the easy way out and do a question and answer show. It's worked really well for the guys over in Maximal Fire, so I thought, why not give it a try myself? So, this will be today's summer special of a God Engine Cast. We're going to go through the round 9-10 questions I have, and I will talk about my answers to each of the great questions. So with all that said, let's get this ball rolling, and we'll start with a question from Tiny Paint Ain't Quaint from Instagram, which is, if you had to add 3 new weapons to the Warlord Titan, what would they be? First up, the obvious answer is the missing Reaver weapons for the Carapace. I would really like to see some flamers, melters, and plasma on the Carapace mounts of a Warlord. But that's just an easy response to this question, and none of them would be actually new weapons. That would be weapons that could be added to the Warlord. So I'm going to look past that and look for 3 brand new weapons that I would like to see the Warlord capable of carrying. First up, I would like to see a Warlord scale flamer. I love the Firestorm weapon, and it's a shame we only have the Inferno gun. It'd be really nice to see a much more powerful version of the Inferno gun on the Warlord Titan. It'd be pretty easy to imagine a Strength 8 5 dice flamer as a main weapon on a Warlord. It would combo really, really well with a Power Fist and be hilarious to use, especially if someone decided to swarm you with Knights. I think a Strength 8 flamer possibly has a really good chance of being good against Knights. It basically restricts their shield saves low enough and will cause enough damage to cause a few criticals here and there if you get lucky. Next, it would be taking a upscale version of the Laser Blaster, a bit like the Gatling Blaster is upgraded to the Macro Gatling Blaster on the Warlord. I'd like to see a arm-mounted turbo laser, a macro turbo laser, or macro laser blaster, I think would probably be the appropriate nomenclature. Add a few extra shots, keep it shield bane on her draining, give it the strength 7, or strength 8 even. Be rather good fun to have a big laser blaster. That'd be a bit different to both the macro Gatling Blaster and the Sun Fury, sort of sit between the two of them. You could also play with the plus and minuses to hit there. There's some definite play. I think it'd also be really cool to see a Titan carrying some sort of Ordinatus level weaponry, perhaps like the sonic cannon that can be found on the Mechanicum Ordinatus Ulanator. Obviously, perhaps not the exact cannon the Ordinatus carries, but a sort of scaled down version, some sort of advanced sonic weapon that the Titan could carry. I think that'd be pretty awesome. I'm not sure what the rules would be, but I think it would be a nice exotic weapon option to throw in there. But overall, yeah, I would really like to see some additional weapons for the Warlord. I was very happy when they released the Volkite weapons for the Warlord recently. And I definitely think that the new Volkite for the Warlord especially is pretty good. I know there's some problems with it on the Warhound, but it is what it is. And at least we are seeing new weapon systems. And I hope here over the next year or so we start seeing some fun alternate weapons for the Warlord as well. So let's keep a theme going and carry on talking about weapons with the first question from Ben Davey of the Maximal Fire podcast. Ben said, Vortex missiles seem a bit good. Would you restrict or ban them at events? Now, he asked me this question via Instagram, and I immediately responded to him my answer, which I will share now, which is I have. I've limited them to 1 per maniple, and only the Princeps Senioris can carry them. I really think Vortex missiles are too powerful for your average game of Titanicus. Their potential to utterly destroy enemy titans with very little interaction isn't the best thing in the world for a game balance, or a game design, or even fun. Unless you've signed on to the idea of just having your titans blown up, which is fine, but I think that's more of the rare occasion than actually wanting a fun game of Titanicus where you see the interactions the whole way through. Anyway, I've had this rant an awful lot, so I'm going to leave it there. But let's just talk about how I'm restricting them. By limiting them to 1 per maniple, it lets players take a few of them, potentially up to 2 in a list, maybe 3 if you really push it at the 1,750 point game level. But you're also then taking the hit that by putting it on your Princeps Senioris, you are ensuring that you aren't going to be able to get the Princeps bonus with the additional Carapace weapon. You're going to feel the loss of losing that Carapace weapon a little more. It also paints a really big target on the head of that Titan before it can fire that missile. Another solution I was playing around with, and I haven't really talked about on this podcast, so I will now, is instead of limiting the Vortex missile, is actually to add a few extra rules to them. Basically, to fire a Vortex missile, you'd be required to shoot it over 2 turns. So the first turn, you declare you are activating the Vortex missile. And then from then on in the game, you could then fire the Vortex missile and it would produce a blast. Now, once you've activated the Vortex missile, or armed the payload, if that weapon was to be hit and destroyed, then the Vortex missile appears on top of your Titan, and the weapon is lost. This would stop the first turn barrage of Vortexes from destroying the opponent, and mean you have to play that first turn slightly carefully to make sure you aren't leaving your Vortex Titans in a place where the enemy can shoot up your Corsairs carrying the Vortex missiles, destroying the Titan. I think it would add a little bit more strategic thought to using the missiles, and it may not be as fantastic at destroying the opponent. And a clever opponent who knows what they're doing may be able to get a jump on you and drop the Vortexes in your own lines, which I feel is a little fairer. Anyway, thank you, Ben, for giving me a chance to talk about that wonderful weapon again. So keeping with the theme of weapons, let's move to the last weapon-related question we have from Richard Willis732 from Instagram. Richard has asked, what upgrades would I like Traitor Titans to get when the new book is released? E.g. weapons. So there's a lot to this question. I can go into a lot of different tangents, but we'll start with weapons and then we will segue over to other styles of upgrades that I want to see in the Traitor book. First up, I would love to see a Ursus Claw and Shot Lance variant for the Reaver. Especially interested in some Shot Lance variants for the Reaver Titan. I think it would be hilarious to have a close combat weapon on the Reaver that would shut down enemy Titans, and I'd like to see a Reaver with a big lance or sword or something. I know I've made one myself for my Legio Vulcanum, and I think that'd be kind of fun. Totally wishlisting and never going to happen would be an upgrade for Traitor Titans to allow them to take exotic weaponry, weapons that have been banned by the Dark Mechanicum and are now been loaded to Titans through the Adepts of Kal Valhal. These weapons could be based on the Chain Fist and Power Fist, and you pay, a couple of points to give them a trait from a list, and then you can go conversion happy and make them whatever you look like. I think that would be absolutely awesome and would be a really fun thing to do. but it involves letting players make their models look like whatever they want, and opens the door to all sorts of 3D printing and stuff. So that's something that Games Workshop's just not going to let happen. So after this, we started to look at the other upgrades that are possible, stuff like we found in the Loyalist book, the general upgrades, and then the Traitor Pacific upgrades. I'm very divided about whether I expect to see new general upgrades. And if we do, I think they're just going to be reskins of the stuff from the Crusade list and given it a slightly lower or higher point cost. I don't think there's going to be any game-breaking upgrades given, like the tracking gyroscopes were. I think that's the high watermark of upgrades. But as for Traitor Pacific upgrades, I hope we see some stuff like, as I just mentioned with the weapons, really embraces the experimentation of the Dark Mechanicum. But at the same time, I'd like them to steer away from always having corrupt titans. I definitely think that's going to be a thing to itself, and I don't want to see the upgrades also sort of, talking about demonic packs and the like. We'll leave that to the corrupted titans. So start with the basic stuff. We'll go for large spikes for better close combat attacks. I'd love to see a missile weapon for the Reaver with a different payload. Perhaps instead of Vortex or Warp, we have some sort of viral component. Some sort of shrouding device would be pretty awesome. Perhaps allowing you to reposition a Titan after deployment. And then perhaps a cheap upgrade, a bit like the Spark of Vengeance, that basically dictates that you always get a certain Machine Spirit roll. Perhaps always being able to charge or move and something along those lines would be fun. I quite like the Spark of Vengeance. The Loyalist upgrade that always allows you to be wrathful, and I'd like to see Traitors have something similar. It adds a bit of flavour and uniqueness to the factions. Sadly, this is not what I'm expecting to see. I'm expecting to see a lot of upgrades that feel a lot more based around the idea of corrupted titans. It may be as extreme as having 4 upgrades, one for the blessing of each of the Chaos Gods. Maybe that's a little too 40k, but it wouldn't surprise me given how some of the recent Titanicus writing has gone, which has generally pushed the sort of conversations about the warfare to being pretty late heresy. But hopefully we will be lucky enough that the upgrades we get in the Traitor book are a little less corrupted, but I'm not holding out that much hope. But let's stick with this theme of what we're expecting from the Traitor Legions book and move to the next question. So next up is Will Robinson's question. He asked this question on Instagram. His question is, we're all aware that some of the Traitor Legio rules are a little bit odd, underwhelming, or conversely very powerful in some places. If you were in charge of the updates for the new Legio rules in the Traitor Legio's book, which 4 would you change and how? So this was on really nicely from the last question. There are a lot of points that I really want to address, but we'll start with the top. Which 4 big sets of rules would I want to change with Traitor Legios? And I'm going to take a bit of a segue here. I'm going to pick out 3 specific Legios, and then there's a 4th, miscellaneous thing I want to fix with the Traitor Legios. And I really hope they're fixed, but I'm not expecting it to be fixed. But anyway, first of all, Legio Krytos need to be completely rewritten. Other than their Quake Apocalypse missile launchers, all of their rules are kind of terrible. They're all about destroying terrain. Even their missile launchers are about destroying terrain, which is really good if you're using those rules, but those rules are optional, and destroying terrain is something you do only occasionally anyway, so they just need a little bit of shoring up and given some love. Also, the whole additional warlord mechanic they have needs to be tightened up as well. I think there's plenty of ways to make them a much better Legio, and I expect to see them having a virtually complete rewrite in the book. Next up, obviously, is the Legio Tempestus from the core book. Their combat drop stratagem needs to be rewritten so it actually works. I think getting rid of all the lines and just letting you just drop a Warhound in just from turn 2 onwards probably works really well and would be fantastically scary, even at the 3 stratagem points it costs. Finally, the Traitor Legio I'd probably really want to have them to have a second pass at rewriting some of the rules for is the Flaming Skulls, the Legio Magma. Their initial trait that affects people's leadership, everyone takes a -1 on the command rolls, and you cannot re-roll command rolls within 8 inches of a Legio Magna Titan. can be overcome with so many other rules that basically let Titans ignore penalties or automatically pass command checks through stratagems, and the whole wording needs to be tightened up. If they went as far as just saying this rule has priority over all other rules, I think that would go a long way and become a little bit scarier. But they could also do something completely out of the box and make it work completely differently. Both of those things are viable. I definitely think that at the end of the day, the Legio Magna needs some love. And as I was saying, there is that final point that I wanted to get to. The other thing that I think would be really good to update in the Traitor Legios book is their core ability for being a Traitor Legio. The Loyalist trait, the free ability you get to switch an order out, is really, really fun. And is fairly thematic. It shows, the strategic thought the Loyalists had. It perhaps showed how most Legios worked before they became infected by the Dark Mechanicum. What I don't like is the fact that the Traitor's ability is to charge better, charge further, and charge harder, as it is that sort of murder, skulls to the skull throne that the Traitor Legios quite often get flavoured as. I think it works really well for Legios like Vulpa. I mean, it's a great upgrade. But I wish there was an alternative. So what I would really love to see is that when you determine your alignment for the Traitor Legio, you get to make a choice. Are you loyal for the War Master, which gives you that sort of crazy bloodlust style, or are you loyal to the Dark Mechanicum, which would perhaps unlock some weird warp tech, perhaps healing hulls or something? And I think it would give you the different flavours of Traitor and give a bit more diversity to the Traitor host, which would be thematic, flavourful, and give the Traitor players something other than charge and murder in close combat, which I think's needed. An honourable mention is needed for Legio Mortis, who are pretty good, but could do with a little bit of clearing up here and there to tidy up their rules and put them back on a power level closer to some of the more recent Titan Legios. As we saw in the Loyalist Legio book, a lot of the Legios with the heavier FAQs were the first published Legios, as I think the game designers got a grip on what they wanted the game to be like. The later Legios have been a lot more efficient for the abilities. I won't necessarily say always good. Some of the Legios in the recent books haven't been great at being on the battlefield, but they've been greater at providing rules that make you have a flavour to them. Something that some of the earlier Legios lack, that the bonuses are fairly lackluster and don't really buy into the overall flavour of the Legio. Legio Krytos being Exhibit A and all that. But anyway, I've talked about this at length, and I think it's been a very well-trodden subject. So let's move on to some other questions. So as we hit the midway point on this conversation, let's go to Ben Davies' next question, which is, why is the Corsair Maniple so good? And he says he would like a 30-minute essay on it. Well, I'm not going to give quite a 30-minute essay, but I'm going to dig into this a little bit. I think it's been an unspoken, pretty well-spoken idea on this podcast, and I know Ben's been advocating it like crazy everywhere on the internet, that the Corsair Maniple is perhaps the best Maniple in the game. Now, that's a bold claim to call it the best Maniple out there. So let's go through and sort of address why I think it is. I don't think it's the most powerful Maniple. That has to go to a Maniple like the Exterminus or even Fortis Maniple, both of which give you abilities to add additional points of damage to get stuck in there and really destroy the enemy Titans quicker. And they really, in the right pair of hands, are incredibly useful. The thing about the Corsair Maniple is they're a lot more forgiving. There's none of this in the right pair of hands with the right strategy. The Corsair Maniple offers flexibility. The ability to move in any direction at any time in the game with no use of stratagems, no degradation of your speed, means that you can correct for mistakes as the game goes on. And you can push your opponent into places of disadvantage. It means you do not need to be thinking 3 or 4 turns ahead about exactly where you're going to place your Titans. It means your opponent cannot think 3 and 4 turns ahead of where you're going to place your Titans, so you will win the maneuver fingering game. your Titans will be in the best lines of sight for the majority of the game, and your opponent will be on the back foot. And that adds up over the course of the game more than a +1 to damage, or +1 to hit, or a reroll. It's just better. It's really good for new players who make frequent mistakes and need ways to fix them, and it's really good for expert players who can use little advantages to really mount up the additional key turning points in a game. It's not overpowered, it's not broken because it doesn't come with any additional bonuses, but Ben is right on the money. It is the best mana pool, and yeah, doesn't create any crazy combos, and some games the opponent is going to be outmaneuver you, and their bonus is just going to steamroll you. Over a course of a game weekend, as Ben proved at the Reactor Meltdown event in the UK recently, you're going to be able to eke out enough wins. But let's also not forget the second reason the mana pool is so good, is that it doesn't call out Reavers on the description of it. It is just Titans within the mana pool. So the Corsair mana pool becomes great for every Legio that can swap out Titans. If you can swap out a Reaver for a Warlord, you take the Corsair, because then you can have a Warlord that moves in any direction, which is way more valuable than a Corsair that moves in any direction. The same is true for the Legios that can swap out Reavers for Warhounds. I'm looking at Legio Solaria there. Moonwalking Warhounds are great. They can move backwards and keep themselves in really good fire lines and protect themselves. And I think that at the end of the day is the secret sauce of the Corsair. It becomes the go-to all the time whenever you're Legio building, because quite often the Legios that specialise in a certain Titan can just take the Corsair and really go to town with it. And should other mana pools appear that also are as loose as the Corsair is with which Titans get the upgrade, I think you'll see other people swinging towards them as well. And there are other examples, but yeah, the Corsair is just an easy mana pool to use, which at the end of the day is why it is good, because anything that is easy to use, requires less thinking, means you have more brain power to concentrate on the other methods of war on the table, and that's how you win. Concentrate on the points that matter, ignore the stuff that doesn't. So the next question is from James Martin Paints from Instagram. His question is, what is the best Legio, and why is it Legio Invector? Now, when I first read this question, I started coming with an answer that talked about the power rankings and which Legios are the most powerful and yada yada yada. All stuff I've talked about countless times on this podcast before. But then I realised that's not the question he's asking. He's asking me what's the best Legio. Best Legio does not necessarily mean the most powerful, though it is going to be a key part of it. But it also means, what Legio is going to be fun to paint, what Legio is going to be fun to collect, what Legio is going to be fun to write background about, what Legio is going to be fun for my opponent to play. I think all that comes into consideration when you're considering what Legio is the best. Or another way to put it is, what Legio is my favourite. Let's start at the top and discuss rules. Which Titan Legios have rules that I like? Not necessarily the rules that are the most powerful. I like a Legio that is interesting to play, that doesn't necessarily guarantee me the win. Not that I think any Titan Legio is overpowered and is in that category. I have to say, though, since Legio Incarnum rules came out, I've started becoming a bit shy of using them. They are pretty powerful. And at times I feel like, kind of nice to play something a little less good. One of the reasons I've got my Legio Volcanum Force coming together. Just, something I can play that's not going to be quite as easy for me to grab victories. For me, the next big consideration is the colour scheme. I want a Titan Legio that looks pretty awesome and unique. Something that's going to be fun to paint and striking when it sits in my display case, which is 90% of the place my Titan Legio is going to live. And then finally, there's the conversation about the lore. I want something that's going to be interesting to think about, interesting to write stories for the Princeps of, interesting to tell stories with as I move my little models around the table. And just to jump to the end in a way, James has a really good point in asking why is it Legio Infector. I think Legio Infector tick a lot of boxes of what I'm looking for in a favourite Legio. And at the end of the day, there is a reason they were the second Legio I covered. They have a pretty fun paint scheme, hilarious rules on the tabletop, and a pretty solid background. The Lords of Valor falling into chaos and becoming the Murder Lords. It's pretty evocative stuff, and really appeals to the chaotic side of me, the side who likes playing my Chaos Space Marines in 40k. And James asks this because he has a gorgeous looking Infector collection, whose photos you can find on Instagram. And I think, he said it as a bit of a joke, why is my Legio the best? But if you're just looking at a unique and fun Legio to play against, yeah, Legio Infector are up there. And then sort of moving past Infector, though, there are a few other Legios that jump out to me as being particularly cool, and ones that I enjoy collecting. Of course, there's Ignatum, whose rules are really powerful. I love the idea that they are the Guardians of Terror. If you're going to play a Loyalist, you may as well go whole hog. I obviously like my Legio Vulcanum, my other collection I'm collecting. They're sort of 2 legions in one is a pretty unique thing. Their colour schemes are also really neato. Also, the background, the fact that it runs into the 40k story is also really nice and gives you some depth that a lot of the other Titan Legions don't get. Mostly because a great many Titan Legios don't make it out the heresy. But at the end of the day, the real answer to James's question is what is the best Legio? The best Legio is whichever one I'm reading about at the moment. I love everything about Titanicus, and I haven't found a Legio I haven't had at least a little bit of excitement about collecting, and when I'm in a deep dive researching to doing a episode, I generally, by the end of it, have started pricing up how I could paint said Legio. It's getting better more I do, but it's a fight, for sure. So next up, we have another question from Ben Davey. Yes, he asked an awful lot of questions. He asks, if I could design a new mana pool for the game, what would you do? I've given this some thought, and I think the best plan would be a mana pool that involves a War Master. Obviously, a War Master plus some Warhounds would allow you to place the War Master on nearly any table, actually within a mana pool. But I actually think a War Master plus 2 Reavers with the optional support of 2 Warhounds would be a really nice little list. A bit of fluff going in there that, this is a way that the War Master can walk to war with 2 support Titans, and potentially 2 Scouts for its larger weapons. Now, as far as special rules, you have to go rather light, because you do not want to give the War Master too much extra bonus here. But then again, every time I fought a War Master, I've been able to take it out because it has some weaknesses. So I think there is some space to be able to buoy up some of those weaknesses by putting it within mana pool. But I think at the end of the day, what I'd look to do is something a bit random. Give the Reavers a bonus to close combat if they're within 12 inches of the War Master. So basically, the Reavers are there to act as like a Knight Shield, anti-close combat bodyguard for the larger Titan. A little bit flavorful. The rules wouldn't be overbearing, give a bit of a buff to the Reaver without giving a major buff to the War Master, who would already get a little buff because he could be the Princeps Senioris, which could be interesting in some builds. And there we go, a nice simple question. So let's move on to the next one. The next question is from James Turner, who asks, drawing on my experience as an event organizer, what top tips would I give someone looking to organize an Adeptus Titanicus event? Does the game have any specific/unique requirements for event organizers? So this is a very interesting question, but I'm going to get stuck into the big ones. So the first top tip isn't necessarily a unique requirement. It's the same issue that hounds all the Horus Heresy games. When you're starting an event, decide how you're going to handle factions. Is your game going to have a narrative focus, so you do not want 2 loyalist players fighting? Or is it going to be sort of more open and then anyone can play anyone? If you go for the more restrictive style, you're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about pairings, and that can be a pretty big challenge. But outside of pairings, then there is the question of unique issues for Titanicus, and there are a fair few. First of all, you need to be very clear about what rules you are using in the game. The Adeptus Titanicus rulebook is really interestingly written. There are the basic rules, and there are the advanced rules, and then there are a whole pile of optional rules that when you get into it, you start talking with some folk who use those optional rules all the time. So when you're starting the event, you have to be very clear about what rules you are going to use. I'm presuming you're going to use the advanced rules, but then the question is, what optional rules are you going to also use? And you need to think long and hard about each one of those optional rules. People may not have had much experience using those rules. They may add additional complexity to the game, and most of the time you're probably better off just not using them. But that can earn some consternation from folks who like destroying buildings, and especially with Legio Crisis out there, whose entire stick relies on that optional rule, yeah, it can be a little bit difficult. I think the biggest issue, though, at the end of the day with Titanicus is about player experience. The other day, one of the game stores I stopped at, I set out to play a game of Titanicus, and the game store owner came over and sort of made the comment that, oh, Titanicus I was playing. You know, this is the best game Games Workshop makes that no one ever plays. And that's kind of how it is in a lot of communities. There may be one or two folk who collect Titanicus, who spend a lot of time thinking about Titanicus, listen to this podcast, play an odd game with a friend here and there, but it's not 40k, it's not everywhere. So when you run an event, you may get a lot of folk who show up to the games having not played many games of Titanicus at all. And not just like I haven't played many games of 40k recently, just like I haven't played many games of Titanicus, and I haven't had the 110 YouTube channels showing me how to play. There's a few. They're really good, but there aren't that many. And that kind of means, as an event organizer, you've got to be ready to teach your players how to play the game, which can be a problem. And I know it's the case when I'm thinking about the Iron Halo. I know I've got some players who will be playing at Halo who haven't played since last Halo, whose game before that was like before the pandemic, and really I taught them a lot about the game at the last event. Fine, Titanicus has a pretty quick learning curve. Handy devices like the Lazy Princeps guide is really useful for helping players through those initial games at the start of the weekend where they have to try and get used to the system again. But it also means I have to keep my gameplay simple. I cannot create too complicated a scenario that I'm adding rule on rule and complexity on complexity. I have to really watch what I'm doing. The top tip and the advice I would offer any event organizer, and the advice I do offer to any event organizer who contacts me to talk to me, is know your audience. And if you're just doing an event for the first time, think about every decision you make about how it's adding complexity to the game, and if you can take it away. Because the answer generally is yes, you want to take that complexity away, just to allow the onboarding of new players easier. There are some tricks you can do to make the event get more complicated as the weekend goes on, or as the event goes on. Say at the Iron Halo last year, I played a Master Vox Blackout on everyone for the first turn of the game. So for that very first turn of the game on day one, no one had an orders phase. That meant I could just get straight on to doing the movement and the shooting phase, just so people got a grips of how the rest of the game worked before adding the complexity of orders. I think it helped a fair bit, actually. It also helped remind veteran players that the best strategy in Titanicus sometimes is not to give a Titan an order. It can be a bit of a trap. But anyway, I think we're getting a little sidetracked. So focusing back on event organizers again. The final big thing I would recommend is don't sweat the terrain too much. I've got an episode coming up where I'm going to talk about this more in depth, but I think some of the best games of Titanicus I've played are on tables which have been a little terrain light. When you get a high density of terrain, the game slows down. So you've got to get a really nice median on the amount of terrain you want on the table. You want to block long distance firing as much as you can, but you want to encourage some fire lanes, some kill boxes, and that can be a little hard if you just build a dense city. And for an event organizer, getting 3 or 4 tables of dense terrain is a bit of a lift. So having a dense terrain, a light terrain, and a pretty open table can really help the pressure of organizing an event, which is like my final top tip, I suppose. Okay, question 9, from Ben Davey once again. What new Titan does the game need? So I think what I want is I want to see the Rapier, a Titan that is going to be lighter than the Warhound operate at an even faster scouting role. What I think the game needs is a Titan that sits somewhere between the Warhound and the Reaver. Ideally, I think we're looking for a Titan that is very similar to the Reaver, perhaps losing the Carapace slot, maintaining the speed of the Warhound, perhaps not quite as maneuverable, and maintaining some close combat chops. Probably have to be a little more expensive than the Reaver if you're going to balance it, because it's going to be a great way to get a Power Fist into action quickly. But I think it'd be really interesting to put on the table and just mix things up in the close combat world and be a good threat to Knights, which at the moment dominate the melee style of fighting. As for weaponry, I'd like to see its common armament being a close combat weapon and some sort of firestorm cannon. I can imagine it just charging up the table as some sort of crusader. And that's about the size of it. It doesn't have to be much, but I think it would fill in a hole at that smaller size game, and perhaps give some armaments to people who want to run many smaller Titans. At the moment, Reaver and Warhounds just sort of flood the table, and they're really good, especially when fighting the larger Titans, so I think adding an extra Titan in there would be good for game balance. So the final question of the day comes from Andy, who's asking me a two-part question. The first part's asking me, do I ever think that we're going to see epic-scale armies in Titanicus? Like, are we going to see some tanks and marines or guardsmen? Also, do I see them ever including Xenos stuff, like Elder and Orc Titans? So let's start with the epic question. Are we ever going to see epic tanks in Titanicus, or are they going to just wait till they recreate epic? I don't know if they're going to introduce tanks to Titanicus, but I think they can. It wouldn't be a huge lift for them to change the rules for Knights to allow them to be tracked vehicles, to allow them to drive around the table. They just wouldn't be able to cross terrain as easily as Knights can. And it'd be really fun to see the scaled down versions of the Shadow Sword and the Baneblade. And I think they'd have a pretty good use on the battlefield. It would be a very easy lift for them to do, and would continue to prime the pumps for them to allow to switch to an epic game eventually. So I don't rule it out. In fact, it wouldn't take much work at all other than the rules writing, so I don't really see it being something they wouldn't do. Does it break the spirit of the game of having tracked vehicles in a game of Titanicus? Not really. The stars of the game are still going to be the Titans. We're still going to be focusing on the Titanic battlefields of the 31st millennium, which do involve the super heavies. The Shadow Swords were designed to be an anti-Titan weapon, and it would be nice to see them on the table, at least fighting Titans, even if they would be destroyed at a moment's notice, as they don't even come with any ion shielding. But in the same vein, I wouldn't mind seeing some Mechanicus Ordinatus engines also created at this scale. It'd be rather fun to see them out there on the table. Even if they were just objective pieces, I think they'd be really fun as units as well. Additional forms of auxiliary support. Now for the tanks that aren't Titanic in scale, your Leman Russ, the Predators. I don't really see them having a place in the game as a whole. Maybe they are something else that will wait until they come up with Epic that will eventually appear. I just can't say when, and I think it will be a vastly different rule set. I think probably once they finish supporting Titanicus as a whole, which may be sooner than I'd like to admit, which I think is a different question, and we'll save that for a later date. So let's start talking about Xenos armies, which also means we're talking about 30k and 40k in Titanicus. For the longest time, I always thought the eventual progression of Titanicus would be to push it into the 41st millennium, but I'm not sure they're going to do that. Reading the latest Horus Heresy book, Mortis, made me realize we do lose a lot of stuff at the end of the Heresy. A lot of Titans are destroyed, and Specialist Titans especially sort of end up going away. So I really think, and I really hope, that the direction they take Titanicus is into the Great Crusade. If they do that, they will be able to add Elder and Orc Titans, and I'm really keen to see both of them in the game. The original game designer of Titanicus has spoken at length that he got plans in theory for the exotic Titans to allow Elders and Orcs into the system. They had the room to fit them in. They even talked about how they would do it. even if they hadn't knocked together the exact rules. So it'd be really nice to see them go with the Great Crusade route. As I've said several times, an Ulanor box set would be amazing, giving me a selection of Imperial Titans and some Orcs. And I'm a huge Orc fan, so I'm incredibly biased and would be absolutely all over collecting a Orc Titan collection should it come about. That all said, the voice at the back of my head is that they're not going to do it. I think it's much more likely that we get to the end of Titanicus, they reach the end of this version of Titanicus, they decide to wrap it up and create a new game with the miniatures, likely to be epic, which would they'd open up either as a 40k game or as a new Horus Heresy game alongside a pile of mini tanks. I really thought at the start of the year that's what they may be doing, and then this new Horus Heresy plastic box set starts floating around. So yeah, I think the idea of Horus Heresy Epic is fairly well reduced, and I also really think they're going to put out Battlefleet Gothic way before revisiting Epic again. Had no confirmation that they're redoing Battlefleet Gothic, but it's something they've talked about in the studio, as it's been mentioned at Warhammer Fests and the like. But I think it about wraps it up for this question. This is ground I've covered a lot, and everyone sort of comes back to this question every so often, so yeah, I'll talk about it some more in the future, probably. It's an endless point of conversation, if I'm being honest. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the God Engine Cast. Thank you all for listening through my random ramblings. I'm probably going to do one of these Q&A sessions again before too long. So if you have any questions you wish for me to answer, please shoot me an email to god.engine.cast@gmail.com, or you can message me through Instagram or Twitter. If you wish to support this podcast, please see the links in the show notes for my Ko-Fi account and for my Patreon. The money from those accounts goes towards helping me improve this show. I'm going to endeavour to put out shows more regularly as we move towards the fall. It's almost that time of year again, I know. Things will get easier. My kids are going to go back to school. My wife's going to go back to teaching at her school. And I will have more free time during the day. That really helps me find a few moments here and there to throw these podcasts together. I usually take about an hour a day doing a little bit of podcast work, but it's very hard when you're trying to chase after your kids, keep your house clean, and work through the inevitable list of DIY projects that me and my wife discover as we wander around our house. Anyway, all that said, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and I hope in a few weeks to talk to you again, focusing on competitive painting once I've finished editing the audio nightmare that I've created for myself. Anyway, until next time. Thank you again for listening to another episode of the God Engine Cast, a podcast dedicated to discussing the Adeptus Titanicus game produced by Games Workshop. This show was written, recorded, and edited by Martin Emery. This podcast is completely unofficial and in no way endorsed by Games Workshop Limited. No challenge to any trademarks or copyrights have been intended. All rights are reserved by the respective owners. If you have any questions of the show, please email me at god.engine.cast@gmail.com or reach out to me through Twitter or Facebook. So until next time, I wish you all good fortune.